Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our final webinar of 2019. My name is Heather Metcalf, and I'm Chief Research Officer at AWIS and PI for the ARC Network. And I'm really excited about today's topic and to really dig in. But before we begin, I want to take a few minutes to cover a few housekeeping items, just so everyone can be familiar with the technology that we're using. So first and foremost, the webinar is being recorded so that it can be made available to all registrants and to the rest of the ARC Network community, people who weren't able to be here today. I know it's a really busy time of the year, so it'll be nice to have it recorded and to be able to share with folks afterwards. We'll be uploading the recording into the ARC Network online community platform as well, so people can access it there. As a short introduction to our webinar platform, which is Zoom, I want to point out a couple of useful features for the app. So first, if you hover your mouse over the bottom of the Zoom window, you'll see a number of different menu options that appear there. And the bottom left side of the screen is where you can control your microphone and video settings, including muting, unmuting, turning your video on and off, and choosing the audio and video source. In the bottom middle of the screen, there are menu options for Q&A, chat, raising your hand, and more. We've placed everyone on mute, and we ask that if you have any questions about Zoom or you experience any technical difficulties, that you use the chat function, and we'll try to help you out through there. If you have any questions for any of our presenters today, please use the Q&A function, and we'll get to those at the conclusion of the panel that we have. Second, I would like to share a little bit about the ARC Network with each of you. I see several people who have come to some of our other webinars and a few new names that are in our attendee list. So the goal of the ARC Network is to cultivate and create a broad community that bridges the gap between researchers and practitioners. As the STEM Equity Brain Trust, the ARC Network works to promote systemic change by collecting previous work and producing new perspectives and methods, as well as interventions. The ARC Network is funded by the National Science Foundation's Advanced Program, and the Association for Women in Science serves as the backbone organization for the project. To learn more about the ARC Network, you can visit our website, equityinstem.org, where you can join the community if you haven't already. Another component of the ARC Network is our Virtual Visiting Scholars Program. This program provides a unique opportunity to select scholars across disciplines to pursue research meta-analysis, synthesis, and big data curation for crucial topics on STEM faculty equity. Our virtual visiting scholars analyze existing research and data, synthesize different, sometimes competing perspectives and frameworks, metrics, and outcomes to offer new insights and applications to the broader community, which is the purpose for our webinar today. So it's my pleasure to moderate this session with our amazing second cohort of virtual visiting scholars today. First, I'll give you a little bit of background information on each of our scholars. So our first scholar is Dr. Allison Mattheis, who is an associate professor in the Division of Applied and Advanced Studies in Education at California State University, Los Angeles, where she teaches courses in qualitative research methods and socio-political contexts of education. She taught middle school science for 8 years prior to pursuing a master's and doctorate of educational policy and leadership at the University of Minnesota. She earned an undergraduate degree at Oberlin College, where she majored in international politics, environmental studies, and minored in geology. Dr. Mattheis collaborates with STEM colleagues on research and advocacy projects related to LGBTQIA+ identities, and is a member of the Advanced Geo team working to reduce harassment and discrimination in the geosciences. Next, we have Dr. Beth Mitchneck. She is a current Professor Emerita in the School of Geography and Development at the University of Arizona. She has held numerous administrative positions, including most recently Vice Provost for Faculty Success at the University of Massachusetts at Lowell, and at the University of Arizona as Dean for Academic Affairs of the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, Interim Vice Provost for Academic Affairs, Interim Dean, and Faculty Associate to the Provost for the North Central Accreditation. She also was lead program officer for the National Science Foundation's advanced program to promote gender equity in academic STEM. Dr. Mitchneck has a dual research focus on migration and displaced populations with an emphasis on former Soviet countries, Georgia and Ukraine, and on gender equity in STEM. She has served on national boards for the Social Science Research Council, the Kennan Institute, and editorial boards for the NALS of the Association of American Geographers and Soviet Geography. She not only has an impressive publication and grants portfolio, but also has used her expertise as a Tucson Public Voices Fellow as part of the op-ed project to speak up about gender equity issues in The Hill, U.S. News and World Report, and Foreign Affairs Online. Last but not least, we have Dr. Teresa Nelson, who is co-founder of the Impact Seat, a consultancy on issues of organizational capabilities of diversity and inclusion. She's also a professor of strategic management in the business school at Simmons University in Boston, and a faculty affiliate in the Center for Gender and Organizations. Dr. Nelson's work has been deeply guided by her interest in innovation, what it is, what it means, how and whom it impacts, and how it is actualized as entrepreneurship by individuals, teams, and companies. As an active researcher, Dr. Nelson is known globally for her scholarship related to women and gender and diversity in entrepreneurship and family business. As an Obama era appointee to the National Women's Business Council, group appointed to advise Congress, the White House, and the Small Business Administration on issues of women in business, she began to specialize in women's role in commercializing science. She now works with the MIT Innovation Initiative, ASTIA, and the Healthcare Businesswomen's Association, among others, to build understanding and organizational capabilities around inclusion as a strategic business practice, particularly in the life sciences. Thank you all for being here to share your work with our audience today. So first, we'll start with Allison. Allison, you have a unique background in educational research, policy, and practice. What project are you focusing on as a virtual visiting scholar, and how has your background shaped it?
All right, okay, I'm using the talk. I'm unmuted. Thanks for giving me the chance to start off and for being a part of this webinar. So I would say, and you already gave an overview of sort of my background and how I ended up in this role where I am now. When I was doing my doctoral research, I was really focusing on issues of racial and socioeconomic segregation in schools and how this impacts educational experiences. And during that time of my own scholarly development, I also ended up with this social network of a lot of queer scientists. So I'm coming to this work really out of both my professional interests in what do diversity, equity, and inclusion really look like when we put them in practice, and how do we change educational spaces, but also how do we make STEM spaces specifically more inclusive. So I started this queer in STEM study in 2013 with my collaborators who now include an evolutionary biologist, a chemist, a geophysicist, and we've been looking at people's experiences. And working on the Advanced Geo project, we're also looking sort of at specific barriers that exist in terms of practice and assumptions in STEM fields and sort of how normativity is working. So I feel like my work on this project is informed by all that I've learned from participants in these other research projects, and I'm motivated by a goal of, as an applied researcher in social science and an educator, what can I do with this knowledge to make spaces better for other people? So what I'm really interested in looking at is, what do people mean when they use the term gender in their research? Because we talk about it a lot, but when we really look at some of the studies that are looking at underrepresentation or women's experiences, they're not fully articulating what they mean and who they think is a woman and the different ways that different women experience that category. And also sometimes we're talking about gender and it's not just about women. So I guess what I'm trying to do is bring sort of growing social awareness and theory from gender studies, intersectionality research that's really raised awareness about how women of color have a different experience. White women have been the biggest beneficiaries of affirmative action policies. And even in some areas of STEM, there's gaining parity in terms of white women's representation, but not people of color. When we add on layers of identity like ability and gender expression, it gets more complex. So yeah, sorry, I don't want to like go on too far because I know we're just getting started, but what I'm looking at in this project is really doing a 10-year review of how this category of gender as a variable has been defined in higher education research, looking at STEM spaces, and then also looking for some exemplars where people are doing it well, and hoping to come up with a set of sort of guiding documents or definitions that could help research in the future be more encompassing of differences in gender identity, gender expression, how that's different from chromosomal or biological sex, so that we're using terminology more specifically, and that we're paying attention to gender normativity more broadly as a force in educational spaces.
Great, thank you, Allison. Beth, similarly to Allison, you've centered equity issues in your academic research, your leadership efforts, and advocacy. Can you tell us more about your Virtual Visiting Scholars project and what led you to focus on the topic that you're centering on?
Sure, thank you, Heather. And I have to say, it's really nice after many years of lots of administration to be able to take a pause and get my head deeply and fully into a research project. So I'm enjoying this, it's a lot. So what is the project? I'm looking specifically at how biases around gender, race, and ethnicity factor into the ways that we practice citation, and then the ways that citation indices are constructed. So it's really, in shorthand, a social construction of citation indices and citation practices. So I'm looking at the literature to assess what's out there. It's really a growing literature, one that I became aware of as I did my job. Faculty success, faculty affairs, managing promotion and tenure, and annual reviews at various levels. And it became really clear to me that we were making decisions about advancement for people's careers without fully understanding the data on which we're basing those evaluations. So I started to talk about it in the various venues in which I was working or speaking, and it was very clear in one particular case that a lot of promotion and tenure guidelines and annual performance reviews, as well as during a recruitment process, people were looking specifically at an H index or at various indices and measuring the productivity and the value and the quality of people's research without understanding that these had embedded biases all along. And I remember bringing it up to one provost I was working with who just said, well, these are really useful indices. So I would say that it really encouraged in me a path to analyze what are the ways that we can understand the impact of our research and then measure it for advancement in a variety of different ways. So I did a research paper on my own research and the impact of that research. And I realized that the citation counts were nearly meaningless. And I had to do a deep dive into what it was that I was accomplishing and who was citing the literature. And then finally, one other factor is I wrote a paper for Science with some colleagues about gender equity and institutional transformation. And we were just really confused that there weren't a lot of citations. So then we looked at the alt metrics, one that looks at attention. And so we can compare 23 citations with an alt metric of 78, which is one of the highest for publications at that time. And so it really threw into high relief the difference between citations and formal publications and then the influence of your paper. So that's really the motivation.
Thanks, Beth. I can't wait to see more about what you're finding as you continue on this project. On to you, Teresa. So your research, teaching, policy work, consulting, and even your investing practices all focus on gender equity and innovation, commercialization, and entrepreneurship, which is the topic that you happen to be exploring as a virtual visiting scholar. How have your experience and expertise inspired this project for you?
Thanks, Heather. Thanks everyone in the network. It's really great to be a part, and this is new for me, and I'm glad to be involved. My dissertation actually was focused on high potential firms. I've always been interested in how new industries and firms change fundamentally how the economy works. And I got focused very early on trying to understand what the economy, what the biggest companies, what the Fortune 500 of 25 years from now would look like. And about 12 years ago, I started asking myself, as part of that question, becoming more and more aware of who was being included in that design and innovation process to lead us to the economy for the future. And you know, it's really distressing to stop and think about whose ideas, whose preferences, whose knowledge is getting included in those decisions that are being made on the ground now and that are building forward. So when I did the National Women's Business Council, as Heather mentioned, I got particularly interested in the SBIR program, the Small Business Innovation Research Grants Program, which is available with STTR to academics to provide sort of a preliminary step for people to investigate their inventions and innovations to see if they have any commercial applications. So we could say that's, can it become a product or service or experience that can be put into the marketplace? And while the program, which is administered across 11 federal agencies and donates about $5 billion a year to these organizations that are exploring their commercialization potential, had met all its marks according to the National Academies of Science and Engineering, except for one, which was the congressional demand that they include women and other underrepresented groups as part of their logic of funding these exploratory ventures. And the performance is so low that actually over the last 8 years, the National Academies have said that the success of the federal government in providing for this sort of expansive, equitable performance standard has declined significantly. So, you know, you start looking at this whole world of how STEM companies, and of course I have focused in here in Boston on biotech pretty specifically since it's such a vibrant part of this city and the institutions here. And you start looking at from a high level policy perspective, how the relationships between the private sector, the government and universities have shifted in fundamental ways over the last 40 to 50 years. The membrane between universities and the private sector is very porous now, with venture capital companies reaching into academic life and looking for opportunities to fund up and coming projects. And what we see is that regardless of the fact that, for example, as we all know, women have made such tremendous advances in PhD biology and other advanced educational objectives, they're tremendously left out of this process as faculty members, as graduate students, as postdocs. So I think this is really of concern, and one of the problems is that the data is very hidden. What faculty do, how they commercialize, how they're involved. And you know, let me say, this isn't just for elite institutions, though I am working now at MIT. Lots of faculty in STEM invent things, right? And so the process of getting those inventions out to the world is of interest. Women are being discriminated against in so many amazing ways. And, you know, I guess I would say my goal with this project is to really look in the literature, which is very expansive, but I would agree with Allison. A lot of the work that's been done on women in terms of faculty commercialization is not really work on gender. It's more demographic work on women versus men. But until we know what's there, it's very difficult to suggest a path forward. So this is why I think the meta-analyses projects are really worthwhile, to support people taking time to put those together.
Thank you so much, Teresa. So now I have a question for all of the panelists. So you're currently about 3 months into each of your projects. What are you learning so far, and what has you excited? And I'll throw it to whomever wants to chime in first.
I'm happy to start.
Go for it.
I think the topic of how female faculty commercialize in the context, of, all right, sorry about that. Almost every field in STEM, I find, has some small literature about men and women and commercialization of faculty. And so the real challenge is to put that together with the idea of what is the quality of the research that is being done. A lot of the papers are simply giving us some statistics on some population somewhere about what percentage of men versus what percentage of women are doing something. And while that can be locally informative, it's difficult to abstract that into something that tells us about faculty in general. So that is both my excitement and my challenge, is to realize, like there's a very large literature in medical schools and women faculty, but in engineering, there's a very large, very large, very small. So putting the fingers out and trying to get a sense of that and where the literature is that is meaningful and that really deserves to be combined, that's where I am right now.
Great, thanks.
Heather, I'm happy to go next. Okay. What am I learning and what am I excited about? The first thing is that I'm learning so much, and that creates a great excitement. So in the review of the literature so far, the synthesis, what I'm learning is that it really is a social construction, that there are ways that we can use citation practice and indices to overblow people's accomplishments or to minimize them and make them a lot less visible. And so I'm reading a lot of literature, and much of it is actually coming out of Europe, which is really fascinating to me, about how citation clubs function and citation networks, and how the research assessment practices that are going on in Europe are influencing the ways that European faculty actually cite. Because we know that citation impacts, we look at the impact of our research by citation indices, and if we can artificially increase the size of those indices, then our university or our department is going to look really good. So there's been a lot of literature about that, which is really fascinating. So the literature so far fits into 4 specific areas. One is that these are just indicators, and analyzing the extent of these indicators, particularly from a perspective that they're objective indicators. And then there's a whole series of literature that looks at analyzing the underlying data for the indices. The third area is that there's a lot of literature on methodology, on how to construct the indices so they'll be better and fairer. And then there's a fourth area of the literature, which I've really, it has resonated with me, is that these measures are really measures of social inequalities and how power in the academic world come out in these indices. So I'm learning a lot. I'm also learning that if we wanted to game the system, I could publish something really well that would help people game the system for their indices. But I'd say there's something that's really important that I'm learning. And I want to give credit to the ARC Research Board member, Kimberly Griffith, whose research I've followed for many years, but she encouraged me to look in areas that were not necessarily peer-reviewed publications, and to look there for information about citation practice and citation indices. And I just have to say, bingo, Kimberly and I have been emailing, And it's really changed the direction that I'm going to go for the next few months, to really look at social media. And it's ironic because what I'm saying is that we need to incorporate social media measures into the way that we looked at our research impact. And here Kimberly is Beth. You need to look at social media to really understand the gaps in the literature, because that's where it can be found. So there's a number of websites that she sent me to about Black women and citation. And so I'm really excited to delve into other ways that the research is expressing itself.
I guess I'll build off of what Beth is saying, and also say that related to my work, I know there's also networks of trans scholars who are trying to create these citation circles as well. I haven't looked into specifically if that work is happening in STEM as much, but I know it's happening in gender studies research. So I think both of your projects are really great, and I'm excited to learn from both of you. What I've done so far, my background is in education. I've been a STEM educator, but I haven't really been a STEM higher education researcher as much as like experiences of folks in STEM and higher ed. So what I've had the opportunity to do so far is become really familiar with basically the disciplinary journals. And that I think has been really valuable for me in terms of even just the resource I'll be able to serve as for my colleagues who do this work and on my campus and in other projects. So currently I've read 4,000 abstracts. This is not necessarily the typical way that you would go about doing a literature review or a synthesis, but what I realized when I was collecting, so I have a list of about 40 journals specifically that I want to look at. And they're divided, one group is basically the disciplinary educational research journals. And the other section is about journals that look at issues of like gender in higher education that might also include things that are STEM specific. So I've started with the disciplinary journals, and then I'm going to move into those other ones. And I'll need to use a different approach with selection of articles from those journals, because they already are dealing with the gender issues, but they might not deal with the STEM issues, versus the other ones, they all deal with STEM, but what I've been looking at is how do they deal with gender. So I've found about, I've tried to be very like generous in my selection so far. So I'm looking not just at how if they mention something related to a term that I'm associating with gender in their abstract, but also if they just look at student identity, because what I've found is there are a lot of journals that really just aren't looking at the identities of students at all in the research they're doing about classroom interventions. So they're documenting activities that they've developed for developing skills in new engineers or something like that, but they're not really talking about the identities. And then when you get into the research that looks at STEM professionals who are further along in their careers, if they're in the PhD or the postdoc stage and moving into faculty positions, which are issues really of relevance and concern to the ARC network, it's not surprising then that all of a sudden they're finding, hey, over here we find that if you're in a marginalized or minoritized group, you're feeling more isolated, but you haven't been given skills earlier on in your preparation to think about how your personal and social identities impact your STEM identities in your practice. So I'll just say, as like a nerd, it's been really fun. And I have a whole separate folder that's called cool articles that have nothing to do with this project, but I want to read them. So I've found a lot of articles that I send to my friends who are engineering professors and are biology professors and chem professors. But some preliminary findings in those journals are that I think one concern that I would identify is how are people being identified in the studies? And I think a lot of it is faculty placing identities onto students without asking them to self-identify. And that's sort of an easy to address concern in a lot of these smaller scale studies. It's faculty doing research on their own practice. They can ask the students. It's not pulling big data from the large federal data sets that might have tens of thousands of participants who have been indexed in a database. It's like, these are students on your campus. There's a different way you could collect the information. And so that feels like a practical, thing we could do to do better. So I think that issue of like, are participants being offered the opportunity to identify themselves? That would be a big step. And there's a lot of lack of consistency within journals themselves about terminology. So I think this is also somewhere where, you know, in my own field, a lot of our stuff is APA, that's the style guide. The style guide includes suggestions about terminology and why you would use certain words for social identity groups, but I haven't found similar guidelines from like journals. So I think that might be also sort of a lever that I hadn't considered before of how could we raise awareness and get researchers to maybe think about their work a little bit differently. And it's related to Beth's work too, right? Everyone's trying to get published. So that's one way that you could help people think a little bit differently about being inclusive in their work.
That's so interesting. Thank you all for sharing some of the initial tidbits of what you're finding. So as you continue to dig into your research, and Allison, you started to touch on this a little bit at the end of what you were talking about, what do you see as the potential applications of your work to practice? And that's whether it's institutional or departmental policy, program development, evaluation, data collection practices, Allison, is kind of what you were hitting on there. Anything else that you think could be influential on practice?
Maybe I'll just go really quickly and we can go backwards again. And just to add to what I'm saying, I just think sort of some real basic 101 stuff would be really helpful for a lot of STEM folks. And I know that from my experience doing the queer in STEM work and advocacy, and every time that I interview a new participant who feels like I'm the first queer, trans, non-binary person I've ever seen in my field, you know, like what people say repeatedly is like, I just want people to understand what the words mean so they could even like use appropriate terminology to make me feel okay at work. So I think that's just a really basic thing, just teaching people about the difference in these terms and how they are significant for people's lives.
Absolutely. Beth?
Thanks. And first off, I'd like to thank Allison for making that point, because I think it's something that we often forget as we're focused on our science, that it affects people's lives. And so that's really important. And I want to thank Heather for this question. My time at NSF has really convinced me of the importance of broader impacts and understanding why we're doing what we're doing. So I think my work should have a lot of practical applications in ways that faculty go through the review process. And when I advise faculty on promotion and tenure, I usually shock our assistant professors by saying that you have agency here and that this is not a process that just happens to you. And so I'm hoping that this research can be used in two distinct areas. One is to really empower faculty to create measures that are more equitable for faculty of color and women, and that it's really important to empower faculty to do that. And then secondly, it's really important to give people the tools to understand the quality of the data that we're using. In our own research, we would never use an index that we hadn't evaluated for skewed data, for bias, for good data, for everything. And here we are using, as a part of normal practice, citation indices on Google and H-factor that we don't really understand how they are comprised, how they're composed. And so that's a second area. I think there's a lot of work to be done with the users of these data and administrators, department heads, senior faculty about what it is that we're actually looking at when we see citation indices. So in a sense, I really want to modernize or bring up to date the ways that we measure impact and influence of faculty in our careers. And so I think that we can do that.
Okay, I'll step in. Thanks so much. I'm really doing my work because of its potential for application to practice. I see there's 5 primary audiences that I'm interested in. The first one, of course, is the university. And the question of what are the rights of a university, but also the responsibilities of a university to ensure that faculty are fair and equitable in their decisions, is a sticky wicket when you put it together with this idea of reaching into the private sector. So a faculty member in general at a, well, at least in an elite institution, but at many others, is given a period of time every week that they can work on matters that are professionally engaged, and which could include consulting or business sort of activities in almost all STEM fields. And, to what degree does the university have a say over who a faculty member engages in that activity that happens outside the ostensible boundary of the university? So for example, we have legions of anecdotal stories about female postdocs and PhD students not being included in the conversations around venture capital, starting companies, getting on scientific advisory boards, having access to that world of commercialization that's actively happening right at the gates of a lot of universities. So in the case of the MIT project that Heather mentioned that I'm involved with, what I was so appreciative of is the leadership of MIT said, we want to know what's going on at MIT. Even if we don't like what we hear, we want to know what it is, and we want to figure out how we can make it better. And I think that's where we have to get a lot more universities and colleges in that position of sort of understanding what's going on. For this topic of commercialization, particularly as we're talking about high potential innovation projects and influencing the economy, we certainly have a whole outside world of funders. So here in Boston, we have something called the Boston Biotech Working Group that includes venture capitalists. 5% of all venture capital in the United States goes to women founders in general. It's probably one of the poorest records of equity that we can find in business practices. So they're an audience because we can say they're missing out on great opportunity by not seeing women as part of their commercialization world. And we can also tell them that they're part of creating this world. Certainly postdoc and PhD students. In terms of women's faculty as well, I think for universities, we have to be careful because right now we're in a period where the idea of founding a business is very exciting in the United States. We like entrepreneurship. We think it's, exciting. You make a lot of money. But to what degree do we really want to push faculty, postdocs, PhD students to think about their career in that way? And to what degree are we minimizing researchers and teachers and people who are deeply engaged in administrative actions at the university, as opposed to commercialization? So I think that's also a tricky issue. And for the university, the faculty, and the postdocs, PhD students, the way I've made sense of this is that they should know about what the opportunities are, but they shouldn't be encouraged to take one path or another. So there's a lot of conversation that needs to happen in that regard as well. And I think the last one is just researchers in general who are interested in STEM and diversity and inclusion, gender and other represented groups, underrepresented groups as well. To understand how we dig out this data that makes it possible to start having meaningful conversations and put the groups on the spot that need to be put on the spot to figure out a way to improve conditions moving forward.
Thank you all so much. So we have about 20 minutes left, and I would really love to open up the conversation to our attendees. So if anyone who is among our attendees would like to ask a question of our panelists, there are a couple of ways that you can do that. So like I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, we have the question and answer option that's in about the bottom middle of your Zoom window. If you hover over that, you can type in a question there and we'll share that with our panelists. You can also use the hand raise function, and if I see you raise your hand, I can make it so that you're able to ask your question verbally. So any questions from our attendees? If not, I have plenty of other questions that I can ask our panelists because I think what they're doing is so interesting. Okay, so we have one question from Alexis. What roles do you envision for professional societies in your work?
Can I raise my hand?
Yes, please.
Great question. I think professional societies have a really important role to play here. And so one of the things that I'm hoping to do with the project is to approach professional societies and have them linked to the database on the ARC website that I'm producing, so that they can educate their own disciplines with what's going on, and that it's really important. And so often when I've been dealing with promotion and tenure issues, faculty will say, well, that's not how we do it in my field, or that is how we do it in my field, and we all just use the same numbers. And so I think professional societies are a critical area to help us convey how citation practice is really highly gendered, and there are very significant intersectional issues. And I'm going to follow up on Allison's point about trans faculty as well. So I'm all for those professional societies.
I'd be happy to throw in absolutely critical. And what I'm thinking about with my work now is I don't know how we're going to reconcile having sex exclusive organizations. And what I see in the world is now we've got some emergence of men only groups starting. And I just wonder what we want to do about that, because I think that's really important. I think for organizations that are made up primarily of women, or who advocate for or connect primarily groups of women, we've got to continue to figure out how to get integrated into organizations where everyone is, because most of the time, as we all know, power and money and decision making rests in those halls. And I'm a big believer in, at this moment in time, finding all the baby boomer men who want to make a difference in this very high point of their career to start a meaningful conversation, but also take action. Take action in universities, take action in organizations to do something about gender inequality. And I think we have to be, professional organizations can really help us to start and continue that conversation.
I'll add in just, so the Advanced Geo project that I'm a part of, our partner organization is actually American Geophysical Union. So our grant is specifically partnering with a professional society. And so that's been pretty inspiring, actually, to think about the reach that a professional society can have across all these other institutions where this work takes place. And I would also say that there are some really positive examples in the professional societies that could be used as a model. And in some ways, because there are still a lot of professional societies, but there are fewer of them than like universities. So it's, if you're looking to sort of translate positive actions in one space to another, sometimes it's easier to make those comparisons. So like the American Astronomical Society has had an LGBT+ physics working group for several years that's come out with these really amazing guides for practice that are developed by people within the community and are saying, like, here's how we can make this space better for people. And I think things that are generated from within communities are often faster to be taken up than things that come from the outside. So thinking about how do we raise the voices of people who are already there, who are just not being listened to, instead of trying to sound like someone from outside is telling you what to do. So yeah, I think there's always a tension with people who are comfortable with power and the system is working for them, making room for other people to influence the conversation. But you know, in my interest in these specifics about being more inclusive around ideas of gender and sexuality, there are some really basic things that people could do, like just talking about pronouns on name badges. This is something that a lot of professional societies across multiple disciplines are talking about, and it seems like such an easy thing to do from my point of view, but it is such a fight in a lot of spaces. So just the idea that you can add a field and this will show up on your badge, you know, that you can think about having gender inclusive restrooms in your workspace. Like, yeah, I mean, I don't mean to minimize the infrastructure that needs to go behind making things like that happen, but there really are things that are sort of small that can have a really long-term impact in just saying, we acknowledge that we're going to make space for people here, even if they're not here yet, because we have kept them out, not because they don't want to be in science. It's because we've actively created the filter that has kept people from participating. And Teresa said something earlier in the webinar that I was just writing down as something that I think is really important, is you mentioned something about whose knowledge is being involved in the decision making. And I think that's really what we're all talking about, you know, whose knowledge gets honored, whose knowledge gets heard, who gets power, so that you're not just tokenized in the conversation, but that you're allowed to contribute to actions moving forward.
I'd love to just jump in with a quick comment that relates to both what Beth and Allison have said. You know, I think this last point about our major associations and how an interest in women or other underrepresented groups has gotten siloed into a special little group that meets on Tuesday in some back room, versus that the leadership of the organization is actually called to task to integrate and include, provide an inclusive environment. You know, I think we're ready for that. I think we can take that step. And I believe that we still need, you know, groups with our affiliations, with our clans, but we also have to move into those more general organizations and make some claims about inclusiveness, and that it's time to do that.
Thank you all. And thank you, Alexis, for that question. It clearly sparked a lot of ideas and some really powerful notions here. I think, you know, something that's really standing out to me in what each of you have said is that professional societies have a huge role to play in setting the tone for what inclusion can look like for the disciplines that they serve. And it can be anything from policy to how they're collecting data about the people who are part of the society, to how they go about creating space. And I think your point even about the name badges, Allison, is a strong one. At our ARC network meeting that we just had in October, we had pronoun buttons where it's write in. People could write in whatever pronoun they wanted on the button and wear it. So that way, if you're not comfortable, you know, sharing what your pronoun is, you don't have to. And even if your pronoun changes, you can wipe it off and put a different pronoun on there. So I think there are things big and small that the professional societies can do to set the tone and to take some accountability around these issues. So thank you. We have a comment more than a question here from Melissa Pasili. She says, incredible and important research happening here. Thank you for all of your hard work, efforts, and insights. I'm on the lookout for baby boomer middle-aged men who are looking to make an impact. We have a women's organization and recently partnered with just a few men in our region looking to do just this. It is really exciting to be asked. We would love to have your input when we are looking for women in STEM to highlight in our exhibit. Wow, looking forward to learning more about your research as you progress. So, words of encouragement from an attendee here and excitement to see what's coming next. Any other questions from our audience? While we wait to have one come in, I think I'll ask a question. So I know each of you have been involved in advocacy in different ways, which often involves something that's slightly different than how you might write for a strictly academic or peer-reviewed journal kind of audience. Would you mind sharing with our attendees maybe some lessons that you've learned about how to write about the work that you do, or how to speak up about the work that you do that's for an audience that's not peer-reviewed journal audience, and like what you found to be effective?
Can I pop in here?
Yes, please.
We've both participated in the Public Voices Fellowship, which is run by the Op-Ed Project. And for those of you that don't know about the Op-Ed Project, when they began, what they realized was that 85% of the opinion pieces were written by white men. And that has changed significantly over time. But this program has really helped me find ways to articulate in a way that people outside of the academy can understand. So having to write for the popular press forced me to really think things out and not to use shorthand. And I find that that has then fed back into my academic writing, where I know I have to use the jargon because some of my colleagues require it, but I can also write much more simply and convey the ideas about inequities and the importance of addressing those in ways that are much more accessible to people.
I was just going to share that I feel like I have really been trying to kind of build my skills as some sort of a bridge between gender studies theory and like STEM folks, because these are two parts of the academy that like exist on a lot of our campuses in the same space and often do not speak to each other and often actually have a lot of animosity. And some of it is around the way that we're prepared to communicate, the way that we're socialized into our fields, but I don't think it's about like personal motivation. And so my goal is to try to be comfortable being someone who can tell both of these groups, like, I'm not an expert in either of your fields. Can you teach me something that then I can try to teach to someone else? And so I feel like actually that's been useful for me, is with any audience, you need to find out what are the things that are important to them and where are they coming from in order to communicate. And so, you know, communicating with scientists is also like that. It doesn't mean I have to become an expert in that field or become a physicist, but I do need to know something about physics in order for me to like speak to a physicist. You know what I mean? Or at least like it's more about honoring that someone does have expertise in something, even if you want to tell them, I would like you to learn something new, I guess, from a real basic teaching standpoint. But so I guess it's more about having to try to communicate ideas to multiple different groups of people gives you more flexibility in how you can explain a concept. So even if that concept is really complex and there are technical words attached to it, you need to find different ways to explain it. And so, and I agree with everything Beth said, that I think that makes you a better academic writer also, because you're still focusing on just clarifying your point.
So thank you both. And I would just add, I think it's really important to not undervalue your own experience. I think everyone's interested in a good story. I think using metaphors and similes and analogies really helps people to understand what we're talking about, and that even by thinking of our communication as a story to an audience, as Allison has said, can help us to choose the right words, the right length of time to talk, when to ask questions. And it really is about the other person understanding. The other thing I'd add is I just finished an article, actually. One of the journals that I was involved in launching, the International Journal of Gender and Entrepreneurship, just had its 10th anniversary. It's so amazing. We created a journal that would look at this intersection. And I wrote an article on the academic practitioner bridge, which is exactly this notion. And just for the academics out there, you know, what I think is so crucially important is that in the public sphere, companies, news organizations, corporation, research arms are putting out data and studies that might be 14 people that they talked to yesterday. And there's a huge need for people with research training to help practitioners understand what these things mean, to be really careful about simple things like what was the sample size and who was asked and who was included. And I think that that's something that anyone with a research methods course in their background can really be of great service. So putting that together with Beth's idea You know, when you see something in your local media that says something about something and it doesn't sound right, anyone who has that research background can pick that apart a little bit and provide a nice rebuttal, and that can create a good conversation.
Great, thank you. It also looks like we have one of our audience members who, Eileen, who is also in the Tucson Public Voices current cohort. So congratulations, Eileen. I look forward to seeing what you write, and I'm sure Beth and I would both be happy to chat with you as you're working on your projects. Oh, Beth, you're on mute.
I thought I took myself off, but I'd really look forward to meeting you. And I think the Public Voices program is a really great network.
I would agree. Yeah.
I wanted to just pick up on something that Teresa was mentioning too about the idea of stories. And I think like in the policy world, you're often, like from a research standpoint, you kind of get this message early on that like different lawmakers and decision makers are persuaded by different types of data. So sometimes this idea of like mixed methodology is very pragmatic, because some legislators want to know the scope of the problem and they want charts, and other people are like, I don't care about that, persuade me with, you know, like a sad story or something like that. When really what that is that like all of those pieces of evidence are shaping the big picture. And so I do think, as someone who's primarily a qualitative researcher, you know, there is still sort of a bias against qualitative research among some people, but I don't really find that in advocacy work. People get it right away. They're like, okay, it doesn't really matter that you need to tell me how many thousands of people have this specific identity. If I tell you this one person is being prevented from doing their science well, they get that that is important and we should address it. So yeah, just throwing that in.
I would echo that as someone who is pro mixed methods. And also, I think when we're in the space of studying issues connected to diversity, equity, and inclusion, too often the excuse that, oh, the N is too small, so we throw someone out of our sample size, becomes an excuse for continuing to erase the experiences of people who have lower participation rates in these fields for the exact reasons that we're talking about here. There are lots of exclusionary behaviors that are keeping them out of these fields or preventing them from continuing on in the fields when they've started there, that if we keep throwing their stories and their experiences out of the data that we're gathering, whether it's quantitative or qualitative, we're kind of missing the point. Great. Any last minute questions? We have about 2 minutes left. All right. Any other last minute comments that any of our panelists would like to make to the attendees?
I would like to go on.
Just wanted to thank everyone, and really glad to be here, and thanks for your support.
And I was going to say pretty much the same thing. So thank you, and keep the comments coming. I think you know how to find us, and it's really useful to have these kinds of interactions to help us think in different ways. So thank you.
Yep, just echoing that too. I'm more than open to questions and critiques and things that push us forward.
Great. Well, thank you to each of our panelists and to all of our attendees today. We're really glad that you made time at this busy time of year to come and join us for this webinar. And we will be sending out an email to everyone who registered with a link to see the video recording in case you want to check it out again or share it with anyone that you think would be interested. Many thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Have a good day.